Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom nestled between sparkling rivers and tall green mountains, lived a good and kind queen. More than anything in the world, she wished for a child. One winter day, as she sat sewing by a window framed with black ebony, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell onto the pure white snow on the sill. She sighed and thought, "Oh, how I wish I had a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony." Not long after, the queen's wish came true. She gave birth to a baby girl who was just as she had imagined. Her skin was as white as snow, her lips were as red as a rose, and her hair was as black as the ebony frame. They named her Snow White, and she was loved by the entire kingdom. Sadly, the good queen passed away, and the king, feeling lonely, married again. His new wife was a woman of stunning beauty, but her heart was cold and filled with pride. She owned a wondrous, terrible thing, a magic mirror. It was her most prized possession, and every single day she would stand before it, admiring her reflection. While everyone in the kingdom adored the growing princess for her sweet and gentle nature, her stepmother, the queen, was filled with a terrible jealousy. Each day she would gaze into her magic mirror and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And every day the mirror would faithfully reply, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." This answer always pleased the queen. She knew the mirror could only speak the truth, and her vain heart would be content. For a little while. As the years went by, Snow White grew even more beautiful. But her real beauty wasn't just in her looks. It was in her heart. She was kind to every person and every creature she met, sharing her bread with hungry birds and speaking softly to the shy deer in the royal woods. This inner kindness was like a light that shone from her face, making her lovelier than anyone. One fateful morning, the queen stood before her mirror and asked her usual question. "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" But this time the mirror gave a different, dreadful answer. "My queen, you are fair, it is true. But a young princess with skin as white as snow, lips as red as a rose, and hair as black as ebony is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen gasped, her face twisting with shock and then with a terrible anger. Her heart turned to ice. She knew the mirror was talking about Snow White. From that moment on, envy grew in her heart like a weed, choking out any goodness left inside. Every time she saw Snow White's cheerful smile, the queen's jealousy burned hotter. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone being more beautiful than her. A dark and wicked plan began to form in her mind, a plan to get rid of Snow White forever. She called for the royal huntsman. "Take the princess deep into the forest," she commanded, her voice as sharp as glass. "I can no longer stand the sight of her." The huntsman was confused but bowed his head. He'd known Snow White since she was a little girl and couldn't imagine why the queen wanted her gone. He found the princess in the courtyard, where she smiled at him with trusting eyes. "The queen has asked me to take you for a walk in the woods, princess," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. Snow White, who loved the forest, clapped her hands in delight, completely unaware of the queen's cruel plan. The huntsman led Snow White deep into the forest, much farther than she'd ever been. The trees grew so tall and thick that their branches blocked out the sun, and a strange silence fell over the woods. Snow White started to feel nervous, but she trusted the huntsman. But the huntsman's heart was heavy. He remembered the queen's cold command, but when he looked at the innocent princess, he knew he just couldn't do it. He stopped in a small clearing. "Princess," he said, his voice trembling, "I can't do what the queen has asked. She is sick with jealousy and wants you gone forever. You must run deep into the woods and never, ever come back to the castle. Your life is in danger." Tears streamed down Snow White's face as she finally understood. Heartbroken and terrified, she thanked the huntsman for sparing her life, and then she ran. She ran as fast as she could, deeper into the unknown wilderness. The woods, once so friendly, now seemed menacing. Branches snagged her dress and thorns scratched her arms. The wind howled like ghostly whispers, and shadows twisted into fearsome shapes. Exhausted and all alone, Snow White finally collapsed onto a patch of soft moss, weeping for the home she had lost. But as she cried, the creatures of the forest began to creep out from their hiding places. A little rabbit hopped closer. A family of squirrels chattered from a branch above. A gentle doe nudged her hand. They could sense the goodness in her heart and weren't afraid. Seeing their friendly faces gave Snow White a glimmer of hope. The animals guided her away from the scariest parts of the woods, down winding paths and across little streams. The sun was beginning to set, and she knew she needed to find shelter. Just as darkness fell, her animal friends led her into a quiet clearing. And there, nestled amongst the trees, was the most peculiar little house she had ever seen. It was a tiny cottage with a mossy roof and a crooked chimney. Everything about it was small, from the little windows to the miniature front door. It looked like a house built for dolls. Cautiously, Snow White tiptoed to the door, which was slightly ajar. She knocked, but there was no answer. Taking a deep breath, Snow White pushed the little door open. What she saw inside was a charming, messy little room. Everything was just as small on the inside as it was on the outside. There was a tiny table with 7 little chairs, 7 little plates, and 7 little cups, all of them dusty. By the fireplace, 7 little beds were lined up in a row. But oh my, the cottage was untidy. There were cobwebs in the corners and the floor needed a good sweep. Despite being scared and tired, Snow White thought, "These poor people must not have anyone to look after their home. Maybe if I clean everything up, they'll let me stay for the night." And so, with her animal friends helping, she set to work. The birds dusted the shelves with their wings, and the squirrels swept the floor with their fluffy tails. Snow White scrubbed the little plates and cups until they sparkled, tidied the room, and made each of the 7 little beds. The whole time, a pot of soup was simmering over the fire, and its delicious smell made the cottage feel warm and welcoming. By the time she was finished, the cottage was spotless, and Snow White was so sleepy she could barely keep her eyes open. She tried to lie down in one of the little beds, but it was too short. Another was too hard. Finally, she found that if she lay across 3 of the beds, she could rest comfortably. She pulled a quilt over herself and fell fast asleep. Meanwhile, the owners of the cottage were on their way home. They were 7 dwarfs who spent their days mining for gold and jewels deep inside the mountain. As the sun set, they picked up their lanterns and pickaxes and marched home, singing a cheerful song. When they arrived, they knew right away that something was different. The door was closed, the windows were clean, and a warm light glowed from inside. They crept into the cottage, suspicious. "Look," whispered the first dwarf, "someone swept our house." "And washed our dishes," exclaimed the second. "My bed has been made," grumbled a third. They tiptoed further inside, and then they saw her. Sleeping peacefully across their beds was the most beautiful girl they had ever seen. They gathered around, whispering about who she could be and where she might have come from. The wisest of the dwarfs placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Hush," he said gently. "Let her sleep. She looks exhausted. We can ask our questions in the morning." So, being careful not to make a sound, the 7 dwarfs quietly ate their soup and settled down for the night, leaving the comfortable beds for their mysterious guest. The next morning, Snow White awoke to 7 pairs of curious eyes staring at her. She sat up with a start, but the dwarfs gave her kind smiles. The wisest dwarf, who had a long white beard, stepped forward. "Good morning," he said. "We don't mean to frighten you. We just want to know who you are." Seeing that they were friendly, Snow White told them her whole story, about her life in the castle, her vain stepmother, the magic mirror, and how the huntsman had saved her life. When she finished, the dwarfs looked at each other with concern. They were simple, hard-working folk, but they knew goodness from wickedness. "The queen is a vengeful woman," the wise dwarf said gravely. "She won't rest until she knows you're gone. But if you will cook for us and clean, and keep our little cottage tidy, then you can stay with us. We'll protect you. You'll be safe here." Snow White's heart filled with joy. "Oh, yes," she cried. "I will gladly stay. Thank you." And so, a new life began. Every morning, the 7 dwarfs would march off to their mine, waving goodbye. "Be careful, Snow White," they'd call out. "Don't talk to any strangers." Snow White would promise to be careful and then spend her days tending to the cottage, singing as she worked. She cooked delicious meals, baked sweet berry pies, and mended the dwarfs' clothes. In the evenings, when the dwarfs returned, she'd have a warm supper waiting. They would eat together, tell stories, and sing songs. For the first time in a long time, Snow White felt truly happy and loved. And the dwarfs found their quiet home filled with a joy they had never known. They weren't just 7 dwarfs in a cottage anymore. They were a family. Back at the castle, the evil queen was gloating. Believing Snow White was gone for good, she strode to her magic mirror with a triumphant smile. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? She expected to hear her own name, but the mirror replied, "My queen, you are fair. It's true. But over the hills where the 7 dwarfs their cottage have made, Snow White is alive and well, and still 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen shrieked with rage. She'd been tricked. She realized if she wanted something done right, she had to do it herself. She went to a secret chamber and used dark magic to disguise herself as a wrinkly old peddler woman. Her first trick was a beautiful silken bodice lace, which she enchanted with a wicked spell. She journeyed to the cottage and called out in a scratchy voice, "Pretty things for sale!" Snow White peeked out the window. She remembered the dwarf's warning, but the old woman looked so harmless. "Let me show you, my dear," the woman rasped. "Let me lace up your dress with this beautiful new one." Snow White, thinking it couldn't hurt, let the old woman in. But the peddler pulled the lace so tightly that Snow White couldn't breathe. She fell to the floor in a faint. The queen cackled, "Now I am the fairest!" and fled. That evening, the dwarfs found Snow White and quickly snipped the tight lace. Air rushed back into her lungs and she awoke. "That was the queen," they warned. "You must promise us never to let anyone in." Snow White, ashamed, promised she would obey. But the queen learned from her mirror that Snow White was still alive. Seething, she created a poisoned comb. Disguised as a different old woman, she returned and offered it as a gift. Snow White refused to let her in, but the queen was clever. "Just let me comb your beautiful hair through the window," she coaxed. The moment the poisoned comb touched her hair, Snow White fell down in another faint. When the dwarfs came home, they found the comb and pulled it out, waking her instantly. "You must not open the door or window or speak to a single soul," they insisted. "The queen will not stop." The queen, now in a blind rage, returned to her secret chamber for a third and final time. This would be her most wicked creation. She took a perfect, beautiful apple. One side was a brilliant, rosy red, and the other a pale green. She used all her magic to inject a powerful sleeping poison into only the red half. She disguised herself again, this time as a kindly farmer's wife, and carried a basket with the poisoned apple right on top. When she reached the cottage, she knocked. Snow White called from inside, "I cannot let anyone in. The dwarfs have forbidden it." "And they are wise to do so," the disguised queen said in a gentle voice. "I don't want to come in. I only wish to offer you one of my fine apples as a gift." Snow White hesitated. The apple looked so crisp and juicy. "I can't take anything from a stranger," she said sadly. The queen smiled a secret, wicked smile. "You're afraid of poison, aren't you? See, I'll prove it's safe." She cut the apple in two. "I'll eat the white half, and you can have the beautiful red half." She took a large bite from the harmless side. Seeing this, Snow White's fears melted away. She reached through the window and took the tempting red half. She looked at its shiny red skin and took a single, fateful bite. The moment the poisoned apple touched her lips, she fell to the floor. This wasn't a faint. It was a sleep so deep it was as if she had left the world entirely. The queen peered through the window and saw her lying still and pale. A triumphant, cruel laugh escaped her lips. "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony," she cackled. "This time the dwarfs won't be able to wake you." She fled back to her castle, where the mirror finally gave her the answer she longed to hear. "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." That evening, the 7 dwarfs returned to a silent cottage. There was no warm light, no smell of supper, and no sweet song to greet them. They rushed inside and found Snow White on the floor, still and silent, not breathing. They saw the half-eaten apple beside her. They tried everything to wake her, but nothing worked. The dwarfs were completely heartbroken. They wept for 3 whole days. They couldn't bring themselves to bury their beloved princess in the cold, dark ground. She looked so beautiful, as if she were only sleeping. So they built her a special coffin, made of pure, clear glass, so that everyone could see her peaceful face. They wrote her name on it in golden letters, telling the world she was a princess. Then, they carried the glass coffin to the top of a hill, and one dwarf always stayed to watch over her, so she would never be alone. A long time passed. One day, a handsome prince was riding through the forest and happened upon the hill. He saw the beautiful girl in the glass case and was completely enchanted. He read the golden inscription and learned she was a princess. He begged the dwarfs, "Please let me have the coffin. I will take it to my castle and cherish it always. I feel I must protect her." The dwarfs, seeing his kind heart, felt sorry for him and agreed. But as the prince's servants lifted the heavy glass coffin, one of them stumbled on a tree root. The jolt shook the coffin and dislodged the piece of poisoned apple that was stuck in Snow White's throat. Suddenly, color returned to Snow White's cheeks. Her eyes fluttered open, and she sat up, confused. "Where am I?" she asked. The prince rushed to her side, his heart filled with joy. "You are safe," he said gently. The dwarfs, who had been watching in stunned silence, let out a great cheer. Their beloved Snow White was alive. The prince asked Snow White to be his wife, and she joyfully agreed. They returned to his kingdom and were married in a grand celebration, with the 7 happy dwarfs as guests of honor at the royal table. As for the evil queen, her wickedness was her own undoing. Consumed by jealousy, she vanished from the kingdom and was never seen again. Snow White and the prince ruled with kindness and grace for many, many years, and they lived happily ever after. And so, the story of Snow White reminds us of something very important. It shows us that true beauty doesn't come from what we look like on the outside. The queen was beautiful, but her heart was cruel. Snow White was loved not just for her fair face, but for her gentle spirit and her kind heart. That kind of beauty, the magic of kindness, friendship, and love, is a beauty that never fades.